Hello, welcome to the Bible Standard. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comment section and we'll do our best to get back to you.
And this evening we're going to speak more about Russia and Europe. And I can tell you that the events in Europe and Russia are devastating. And we're going to see a world that's poised for conflict like we've never seen it before. Just before we begin, we want to set the expectations from the prophetic word. We, of course, know that the image of Daniel chapter 2, we know that it speaks about a latter-day event in which all of these kingdoms together stand as one dynamic unit, from France all the way through to Afghanistan. And that alliance, of course, will be run by Gog himself, Russia, and eventually that alliance will take place. We also know from Daniel chapter 2 that when we come down to the legs of iron and the feet, which are part of iron and part of clay, the prophet Daniel tells us that Europe will be a fractured community. It'll be a fractured community that has the strength of the iron, partly strong, partly weak. And we're going to look at Europe today in the light of that. We also know from Ezekiel chapter 38, and I'm assuming a lot of knowledge here, Ezekiel 38, that there is a power that will support Israel, that will, protest the invasion. And we know that to be Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof. And as we have there on the screen, that really is the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, which we're not going to talk about this evening, but we are going to talk about the relationship between Tarshish, Britain, and her young lions, because we very much are involved in that scenario. We also have the prophetic interpretation, of course, of Revelation 16 that we've read this evening, the frog-like spirits, which emanate from three key centers. From the center of Europe, the beast, from the false prophet in the Vatican, and from the dragon, which apocalyptically is in fact Turkey. So we're going to have a look at that as well this evening. And we also know that Europe will be dominated by Catholicism, this harlot woman that stands there and embraces through all her immorality all the known religions around the world which are affected by Christianity, except Christadelphians. She is the mother of harlots, and she is the enemy as far as we are concerned. And hence the exhortation in Revelation chapter 18, come out of her, my people, have nothing to do with that evangelical and Catholic system. Don't be seduced by that. That's the message of Revelation 17 and 18. And we're going to see, in fact, how Catholicism is working its way through Europe itself. So that just sets the prophetic expectations, and we're going to look at some of those things in relation to the events in Europe today. So our address this evening is going to focus, really on the effects of the Ukrainian war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war's been going on nearly 4 years, would you believe? And this has had an interesting effect upon the geopolitics of Europe itself. So we're going to look at some of those areas in relation to Russia and Europe. We're also going to have a look at European affairs. We're going to look at the different countries within Europe. We're also going to look at the enlargement policy of the EU in relation to Scripture. We're going to look at the frog spirits particularly. And lastly, we're going to look at Britain, America, Australia, and the relationship that we have with each other. So that's where we're heading this evening, and hopefully you'll be able to follow that kind of pattern. So one of the great effects of the war in the last 4 years has been the Russian economy. Now, as you can see there, the predictions are that in 2025 and 2026, there will be a slowdown in the Russian economy. The difficulty we have with these figures is of course, the Politburo only releases figures that you want to hear. And there's a lot of secret information that really isn't exposed to the West. So these are just guesstimates. But the guess estimates are that in actual fact, the war is having an effect on the economy itself. And as far as output is concerned, the GDP will be much lower in 2025 and 2026. You'll notice there on this particular chart, there's a light blue and a dark blue, and the dark blue is the revenue that was received from gas exports into Europe. Those are now shrinking because, of course, Europe is moving away from Russian gas and has successfully moved away from Russian gas and imported gas from the Middle East and also America itself. But as you can see from that chart, the revenue coming into the Russian economy is growing. And even though pundits suggest that the economy itself is looking bleak and that the revenue from the gas sector is in fact decreasing, really that chart is showing that revenue from Russia is increasing. So there is a mood out there. The optimists think that Russia's economy is doing okay. The pessimist thinks it'll be in decline. But what's happened is that to gain trade within the world economy, Russia has pivoted to the south and to the east. And you'll see there on that particular chart that it's really moved across to Turkey, India, and China. And the relationship between Russia and China is highly significant because you see these two international economies share a similar kind of goal: to destabilize the West and to economically drive their own economies, particularly China. We find, in fact, that the effects of sanctions haven't been quite as successful as was hoped by the West. And really, there has been a general failure in relation to sanctions. That's why the Russian economy has been able to move past all of these deficits to, in fact, be reasonably robust. The purpose of the sanctions was to force the Russian economy to collapse and therefore halt the war. It's been a dismal failure. Despite the fact that there have been 16,000 sanctions imposed, Russia's economy has demonstrated a resilience over the last 3 years. So nothing's holding Putin back. Money isn't a problem. And the economy is bouncing back because, despite those sanctions, it has failed. The first reason why it's failed, as we saw before, it's developed alternative trade routes. And those networks into China and India, into Turkey, have all but balanced out the trade issues they had with the West. So they have neatly bypassed those sanctions. The second reason is that they have something like 350 shadow fleet tankers that are crisscrossing the world and allowing Russia to sell oil on the black market. You may recall that Donald Trump has grabbed some Venezuelan oil tankers, and that's just a very small percentage of the shadow fleet that's going around the world. So this deception, this way around Western sanctions hasn't really been a problem as far as Putin is concerned. He has found a way around that. And the third way is that he's passed the cost to the consumer. So they've had tax hikes, and the ordinary Russian on the street has forced to draw on his belt, and increased taxation has meant increased revenue for the Russian economy. So really, it doesn't matter what the West attempts to try and do to the Russian economy, it really hasn't succeeded in any real effect. There's always a way around the problem, and Russia has found that, particularly when it allies itself with nations like Iran, China, and Turkey, who are more than happy to bypass Western sanctions. Well, let's look at the Russian military strategy, because it's really been quite interesting what's happened over the past 4 years. There's a think tank in the UK called the Royal United Services Institute. Would you believe it was established right back when the Duke of Wellington was around? So it really is quite an established think tank. In fact, this particular group of people, consultants, if you like, in geopolitical affairs to the British government. So it's really quite interesting. So they make the point that really Russia has failed in 4 of its 5 strategic objectives in this invasion. It hasn't achieved political subjugation. There's been economic sustainability, regime stability, and international standing. And only in territory has it really done anything? This particular institute calls it a Pyrrhic victory. That is, they have gained some ground, but at enormous costs. And you almost question the nature of the victory. But as we have there on the screen in red there, what this institute says is that we're entering dangerous times. We must not prepare for a resurgent Russia, but a desperate Russia. Now, one cartoonist put it this way: barely stoppable. And that's Putin. Instead of riding a motorbike, he's riding the Russian bear. And really, when you poke the bear in the eye and you push it into a corner, then that's when the bear becomes dangerous. So 4 years have produced a dangerous individual, a desperate individual. And what we find is that the Russian military strategy is not just confined to Ukraine. What's happening is that NATO on the other side, and we'll see their strategy in a moment, NATO is definitely gearing up for conflict. So what Putin has done is he has escalated fear within the European countries by suggesting that he would possibly use a nuclear deterrent. And just the fear of nuclear escalation has been enough to paralyze decision-making within certain countries. We also find that what's been preventing Russia from moving into other NATO countries, and you don't often think about Russia going to NATO countries, is the fact that NATO has been unified in their response to Russian aggression, and Ukraine has continued to resist the Russian troops. And what this institute says is that that didn't happen, that Russia would be marching into NATO countries. Now, that's quite significant. I don't think here in Australia we really understand the tension that's occurring in Europe because of this invasion. The Institute made the point that should those two factors weaken, in other words, if NATO becomes divided, should I say, NATO becomes divided and Russia starts to move into Ukraine further, then this idea of Russia touching NATO countries is a significantly increased risk. Really quite frightening. So there's a map there on the screen there of the amount of territory Russia has conquered in red, and the blue area there is counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces. And as the Institute says, despite spending billions of dollars, in spite of throwing thousands and thousands of troops into Ukraine, the advances have been almost 50 meters a day, which is less than what was achieved in World War I in the trench warfare in the Somme. And the cost has been enormous. 1.4 million Russian dead and around about 600,000 Ukrainian dead. That's a significant loss of life. In fact, what Russia has been doing is been going to African countries and trying to get people from Africa to actually contribute to the Russian war machine. And there are stories coming out of there that whilst they're paid significant dollars, when they arrive in Russia, they're trained for a week, given a rifle and pushed into the battlefield as cannon fodder. This is a gruesome country we're talking about. This is a country that has no regard for life. This is the Russian way of doing warfare. You just keep pushing more and more troops and war material until you just overwhelm the enemy. And I don't think they really bargained for Ukraine's resistance in the way it was. But beside all that, we find that Alexander Mikhailov, who's a military political analyst, says this: at the macro level, Russia outperforms the entire defense industrial complex of United Europe in weapons and ammunition. Now, that just gives you an idea at the size of the Russian military machine. Put all the EU countries together, and Russia's armament manufacturing complex is far greater. Europe, with its 500 million population, about 30 developed countries, at least 10 of which have established defense industries, cannot currently compete with Russia's combined defense sector. And this is a significant advantage. Russia's churning out hundreds of tanks per month. So whilst they're losing war material, they're producing far more than Europe can ever produce. That just shows you the scale of the Russian military complex. It is vast. Well, on the other side of things, Russia now is entering into what's called asymmetrical warfare, shadow warfare. To secure its grip on power, Russia adopts Soviet practices coupled with modern tactics of covert influence, violence, and manipulation. And this particular article here mentioned that these attacks, which are coming almost under the radar, are designed to confuse and to destabilize the West. And because it's not outright declarations of war, NATO can't respond necessarily and attack Russia back. But nevertheless, it's highly effective. We also find that China itself is engaging in this shadow war. That's why you have these military exercises with Taiwan. This is why you have China pushing into the Philippines and South Pacific. It's this shadow warfare, pushing and penetrating, but not outright declarations of war. China and Russia share common interests, weakening US leadership, fracturing Western unity, and creating strategic paralysis across the democratic world. So that's how they walk. That's how they engage in warfare. Now, let me just give you an illustration of some of this shadow war. So that's a map there. Yes, it's come out reasonably well. And between 2018 and 2025, those are all of the little dots around Europe in which this shadow warfare has taken place. And you might wonder why we have a picture of a yellow DHL plane there. Well, what happened was that last year, unknown assailants, which they think can be traced back to Russia, camouflaged in sentry devices and sent them on these DHL planes into European centres. If they hadn't have been picked up, then those planes would have exploded mid-air. No one's claimed responsibility, but the finger's pointing to Russia. We find, for example, in Poland that there is a strategic rail corridor which is necessary to bring vital supplies into Ukraine that was sabotaged last year. In Romania, Russian drones have penetrated Romanian airspace and put Romania on alert. We find also in Belgium, there was drone incursions in the local airport. They had to shut the local airports down in Brussels and Liège. Russian drones just going into NATO airspace, just penetrating, but not outright declarations of war. In Ireland, a group of military drones got in the way of Zelensky's flight path as he's flying over. If that's provocation, anyone's book. And in the Baltic area, between 2023 and 2025, 10 undersea cables have been cut. This illustrates those cables through there. The cables are in red. Now you can imagine the damage to the infrastructure. Internet goes down, communications goes down, business goes down, and these ships just have a giant dragnet, and they just drag through and just cut the cables and off they go. Again, Russian asymmetrical warfare. And all of this is putting tension and destabilizing the West. How do you confront all that? Well, that's NATO's dilemma at the moment. So the Russian toolkit. Sabotage, often a time to appear as accidents. Clandestine reconnaissance by GRU, that's the old KGB, or such, that's the military part of the KGB, posing as tourists. Students, intimidation, unexplained explosions, and deniable proxies like the Wagner Corporation. So all of these tricks are now being exported to destabilize the West. So what looks like just Russia and Ukraine goes far beyond the borders of Ukraine. So EU and NATO need to respond. And what's interesting is that it has changed the dynamics of NATO quite significantly. So we find that initially NATO embraced Sweden and Finland into its embrace. Now, this is interesting. It's ironic because Putin invaded the Ukraine on the pretext that it wanted to keep NATO at bay. But what it did was it actually drove Sweden and Finland into NATO. And the NATO doctrine now began to shift, making Russia the number one enemy. So ironically, what Putin was trying to avoid actually occurred. We also find that one of the great changes has become the nation of Turkey. Turkey has this very, very interesting business model. We'll do business with Russia and we'll do business with America. And by keeping both countries sort of, I guess, on their toes, has managed actually to elevate its status amongst the nations. Erdogan's economy might not be going particularly good. He might have a lot of fraction within his particular country. But what he has done is he's actually played the West against Russia, and he's done that successfully. So that's been an interesting development in Turkey. We'll come back to Turkey a little later on. And what's also happened is that America, of course, has had to step in to fund the Ukrainian defense. Europe has really, I guess, been very scattered in its approach in supporting the Ukraine. And we find, in fact, that America has had to step in for that. And that has reinforced, until just recently, this dependence upon America. But we're going to see that there have been events in the last 3 months that are fracturing this US-EU alliance. One of the significant factors in the whole doctrine of military strategy within NATO is that Washington has said to NATO, unless you make 5% of your GDP as part of the defense budget, we will not actually invoke Article 5. Article 5 is if a country invades a NATO country, the rest of NATO will respond in defense. And Russia has said, unless you get your input into NATO up to 5%, we will not support you in that doctrine. Now, there on the left-hand side, you can see the contribution of countries to NATO. And really, they're well below 3%. Well below 3%. In fact, the main countries that even hit 3% are those which border Russia itself. So Trump has put the fear of God into them, if you like, and said, unless you actually increase your contributions, we will not be supporting you. What's the talk in NATO? Yeah, we don't often hear this in Australia, but the talk is really quite concerning. So this is NATO chief, and in December last year, he made a speech. And in that speech, he said that Russia could attack NATO within 5 years. Now, that's quite alarming. 5 years, Russia could advance. And he made the point that the question is not whether, but when. And the current scenario is for Russia to go into the Baltic states first, and their warfare will commence in Europe. Now we don't hear this. We just hear this war of Russia slogging it out with Ukraine, but the ripple effects have been enormous. And there's a great fear within the corridors of NATO that this invasion is actually going to spawn a deeper conflict later on. According to a recent report by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Russia has been producing 150 tanks a month, 550 infantry fighting vehicles, Lancet drones, and artillery pieces. It is gearing up for a wider conflict outside of Ukraine. Analysts say it would take years for Western countries to match that mass production of weapons. So immediately Russia has a massive advantage. It's a worry for NATO. And lastly, France and Germany have recently moved to revive a system of voluntary military service for 18-year-olds. At the moment, it's voluntary. Now, we have ecclesias in Germany, and we have young people in Germany. And this whole scenario, if it continues to gain momentum, is going to have an impact on our young people in Germany if they change it from voluntary to mandatory. So it's just a very real situation. We find, in fact, also that this procurement of weapons and building of weapons, like the foreign policy article says here, it's a warning for Europe. Russia, alarming trends, says the article, rapid production, nuclear facilities, strategic platforms, and investment for something beyond the Ukraine conflict. And all the meanwhile, of course, there's talks of peace. However, whilst Russia's talking peace, it's also sending drones into the Ukraine. And the current strategy is to freeze Ukraine to death. So all of the drones going across there are hitting electrical grids, destabilizing nuclear power plants, trying to knock out the electricity grid, and in the end, to freeze Ukrainians to death. That's their strategy. Ukraine is also sending drones into Russia to try to do the same thing. But Russia's electrical grid is a little bit more spaced across the country. But Putin is very happy to talk peace and still send the drones in. You think Putin's a tough negotiator? He is giving absolutely nothing away. His demands for peace: Ukraine must abandon NATO ambitions, can't join NATO. The land that we've conquered, you can't have that back. I particularly want the area of the Donbass, which is that eastern part of Ukraine where minerals and industry are. And any NATO-like guarantees that you give, we will not accept. So Putin is just happy to keep hammering away at the Ukraine. Hammering away whilst talking peace. Come across to Daniel chapter 8. We haven't got time to explore the reasons why we're going to say what we're going to say in Daniel 8. But in Daniel chapter 8, we have a picture of a Roman power which will eventually be taken over by a Russian power. And in verse 25, through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper, priestcraft, religion. He shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Now, that tactic of suggesting peace, negotiating peace, and yet at the same time destroying the Ukraine is going to be magnified in a Armageddon context. And whilst he speaks peace, he also is out to destroy. He is a deceptive individual. He is a non-negotiable kind of man. Those are his terms, take them or leave them. And that is creating angst in Ukraine. 4 years, Russia can continue. Ukraine is having trouble maintaining that war, particularly when countries are not supporting through finance and weapons. So in all of that, brothers and sisters, we find that there's tension leading to potential further conflict between NATO and Russia. We don't know what the outcome will be eventually. We do know that Russia and Europe will be together. I suspect at some point, and this is just pure speculation, that what will happen is that there'll be some type of negotiation which will concede territory to Putin. Ukraine will unfortunately be taken advantage of, and Russia will then continue to try and take Ukraine by some other means. And I think that Europe will realize that it just can't compete militarily with the output of the Russian war industry complex. And I think eventually it will concede its position to Russia. Now, for that to happen, we may have a change of leadership in Russia. Putin is 73. Well, he's still got a few years to go, I suppose. But I do think that the situation at the moment, tense though it is going to put pressure on Europe to seek peace. And we'll just have to wait and see how that happens. But in the end, Russia and Europe will be together in this massive alliance to attack the nation of Israel. So we just need to keep an eye on that. But the place is tense, absolutely tense. So let's turn now to Europe itself. We see that they had an unexpected sense of unity a little while ago in putting more sanctions upon Russia, but again, that really didn't have an effect. But unfortunately, the internal divisions of the European Union are such that it doesn't really have the authority to lead in world affairs. It has this huge bureaucracy that's almost impossible to make decisions quickly. And that's going to affect the whole geopolitics of Europe. A divided, fractured Europe at the moment is very much divided. You know, we spin around the countries of Europe and we find, again, tension, destabilization, and uncertainty. Take France, for example. The French government under Macron has lost 5 prime ministers since 2022. 5 prime ministers. It has a national debt of 3.4 trillion euro, and it can't pass the budget. Hasn't got the parliamentary wherewithal to do that. And what that has done is it's opened the way for the far right in France, under Marine Le Pen, to possibly now begin to take power within France in the next coming elections. So destabilization generally produces a right-wing reaction, and a right-wing government is more often likely to favor dialogue with Russia than a left-wing government. So France is destabilized. Germany itself. Germany has a very lackluster economy. A significant change to German military doctrine means that it has now almost doubled its contribution to the military budget. And once again, a generally weak German government is being exposed to far-right parties, which may likely start to take control of the counties in the next elections. The Baltics. These are, I guess, the sensitive areas within NATO. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. And these 3 Baltic countries know that they are exposed, and therefore they have boosted their military expenditure. They have been subject to shadow warfare attacks. And when you look at commentators about the fate of the Baltic states, half of them say Russia will invade them, the other half says no, they won't. So it's very divided opinion at the moment. But they are on the foreline of Russian military expansion. In fact, this was an article, The Bear in the Baltics, reassessing the Russian threat in Estonia, top there, under the heading, Russia is Scary. For authorities in the European capitals affected, the pattern of Russian incursions is ominous. It suggests a Kremlin willing to risk calibrated provocation and perhaps even a direct attack on NATO's eastern flank. And that came from the Polish armed forces in November last year. A calibrated provocation and perhaps even direct attack. We find in Europe there is a little enclave called Kaliningrad. I don't know whether you've heard about this little enclave, and this enclave is fed by a little rail corridor that links Russia with this little enclave. And what Putin is saying is, because it's Russian, is that if NATO even thinks about taking this little region, or even provokes Russians in this little region, then there could be a risk of large-scale conflict. So this is the kind of intimidation that Putin is using at the moment. Belarus. Well, Belarus at the moment is pro-Russian, and so Russia has now stationed in Belarus nuclear missiles. Now, it's one thing to threaten nuclear warfare. It's another thing to put your nuclear weapons right next door to NATO countries. So this is this intentional provocation by Russia. Poland, well, Poland, again, very much in the sights of Russia because it borders Belarus, which is pro-Russian. For the first time, Polish NATO forces had a direct conflict with Russian drones and Russian fighter planes. Poland realizes that they need to increase their defense spending enormously. Everyone's on edge. The Balkans, the soft underbelly of Europe. They're attempting to try and join the European Union. And whilst Russia doesn't have a significant foothold in that region, it does exploit differences between and vulnerabilities of the European Union. And it will continue to exploit that. Hungary. You've probably heard of a man called Orban. Orban is a pro-Russian leader in Hungary, and he is a thorn in the side of the European Union. He will do anything to support Russia. He'll do anything to undermine the EU's stand against Russia. And he is really almost a little tin pot dictator. However, elections coming up this year are going to threaten that. The economy is tanking. The country itself is in disarray. But pundits suggest that Orban will use all the dirty tricks in his book to try and get re-elected. And if he's re-elected, he will definitely continue to be pro-Russian. So you've got a pro-Russian country in the middle of Europe. Romania. Romania itself is a strong supporter of Ukraine and Moldova, which is just north of there. And we find, in fact, that that country also faces a perfect storm of poor economy, of agitation, of a huge budget deficit. Italy. At the moment, Italy is run by a right-wing coalition. In fact, the current Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, is good friends with Donald Trump. But she's warned her staff that this year will be much worse than 2025, mounting debt, weak growth, global uncertainty, and a debt which is 137% of GDP. They can't afford to pay the interest on the loans that they've taken. Now, all of this is destabilizing, absolutely destabilizing. And Russia is in there ensuring that destabilization continues. And as I said, I suspect that eventually all of this perfect storm of these countries with their huge problems are eventually going to have right-wing governments, which will eventually favor some type of alliance with Russia. But that's pure speculation, and we'll see how we go. But the thing I want to talk about now is EU enlargement, because I find this really quite interesting. So the European Commission puts out a document about expansion of the European Union, and their long-term goal is security, peace, stability, and prosperity. Okay? And it's prosperity that, of course, is the euro figure, the dollar figure that drives this whole union. And based on the French Revolution, it promotes common values, democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights, and so on. So this is a whole entity based on the export of the ideas of the French Revolution. However, they've got a problem. The EU is already struggling to reach consensus amongst its members. And the reason for that is that we have different countries with different economies and different values and cultures trying to sort of shoehorn their countries into an EU kind of model. And it doesn't work. So Germany has come up with the idea, well, we really need a two-tier decision-making system, Europe of concentric circles. So countries like Germany and France and Italy would be in the center, and they would make the decisions, and those around them will be peripheral, and they could either agree or disagree with the central decisions. Because without that, government in Brussels is paralysed. Now, this will change eventually. Revelation says that at the time of the end, those 10 horns, those individual countries will give their power and authority to the beast, to the European Union system. And this idea of concentric circles with a core group of countries will be at the focus of that, and that will allow them to make decisions quickly. Now, here's a map of EU enlargement. And as you can see there, the blue is current member, purple Ukraine and Moldova is in purple, potential candidates, one of them there in the Balkans, applicants are negotiating, and of course Britain is out of that. Now, I want you to remember that map. Look at the extension and the extensive domain of that map. Here's the NATO map. Very similar indeed. A couple of countries there which are neutral or who have not joined NATO. Now, I want you to picture the last two maps in relation to this. You see, when Russia pulls together the territories of Daniel chapter 2, it's going to involve the undivided Roman Empire plus, eventually, Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, in that area. So this map is almost the same map as the last two of the EU and NATO. And what the angels are doing is pushing these countries together to form this undivided Roman Empire kind of map, because this has to be the picture in the end. And when this country map is united with Russia, the image will start to stand upon its feet. Okay, let's just go back, okay? That's Europe, EU, NATO, and it's exactly the territory of the undivided Roman Empire. So we are beginning to formulate across the world this EU enlargement, which is beginning to mirror the ancient Roman Empire. And eventually that'll be absorbed by Russia. Now, to assist in all of that, we have this energy, which we read of in Revelation 16. Just come back to Revelation 16. I've always puzzled a little bit about the frog spirit in Revelation 16, how it could possibly bring all nations to Armageddon. It all began, of course, in the French Revolution. Two classes, the oppressors and the oppressed. The oppressors were the clergy and the nobility. The oppressed were the commoners. And, of course, the French Revolution was a political revolution. And then as time progressed, the influences of the French Revolution began to move into Marxism and a class revolution. So it was still the oppressors and the oppressed. It's just that now, with the clergy gone out of France and Europe becoming more secular, Marxism took the French Revolution language and applied the oppressors and the oppressed to the owners of capital being the oppressors and the common workers being the oppressed. So the doctrine is similar, just the actors have changed. And we had a class revolution, socialism, communism, Marxism. And in our generation, over the last 10 years or so, we've had a cultural revolution where the oppressors are now the privileged and the oppressed are the marginalized. And this doctrine of liberty, equality, fraternity has now gone into a woke kind of environment. Western Marxism, critical theory, postmodernism, all of those philosophies now in a cultural revolution. Our culture's under attack. What's happened from there on is that we've now had the next phase, which is an international revolution. And the oppressors are now countries like Israel, and the oppressed are countries like the Palestinians. And that has developed into what we know today as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic intent. So it's interesting, isn't it, how this has morphed, if you like, from political revolution, cultural revolution, and now to international revolution, principles are the same, but the actors have changed. So what we find is this. The Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust, is already here. The warning signs that preceded the Holocaust are visible again, this time on a global scale, and cloaked in modern language. That's the never again, which of course is the cry of the Jewish people. And this I find interesting. This language of hatred is not carried out today by centralized scientific machinery issuing orders from above. It proceeds from below, croaking in the marshes, if you like, through society itself, through a pervasive international network of indoctrination, where human rights are weaponized to justify madness. Now that's Revelation 16. This frog-like spirit is the spirit of demons, madness. There is no rationality. Whether you're the extreme left or the extreme right, Israel is common enemy. And the language is irrational, it's madness. Israeli actors assaulted in the street, police explaining that shouting threats is protected speech. Violence is excused by a doctrine that divides the worlds into the oppressors and the oppressed, where revenge is not only permitted, but morally required. Now that's an interesting article by the Jewish News Service there. The frog spirit, which brings all nations together in Revelation 16, is the end result of those revolutionary forces unleashed in the French Revolution, which has now morphed into anti-Semitism. And really, the tidal wave of anti-Semitism is ferocious. So there's a group called ADL, Anti-Defamation League, and they monitor through statistics the number of anti-Semitic acts that occur through the world. An estimated 2.2 billion people, that's 45% of the world population, harbor anti-Semitic attitudes. Can you believe that? The Bondi shooting in little old Australia is a manifestation of that. 2.2 billion people harbor anti-Semitic views. 1/3 of European Jews, when they visit Jewish events, don't feel safe. 44% of young European Jews have experienced anti-Semitic harassment. And 71% of European Jews no longer wear Stars of David, kippahs, their hats, and so on, which identify them as Jewish in the street. Anti-Semitic attitudes are rising among young people as the memory of the Holocaust fades. There are three key centers where this anti-Israel, anti-Semitic behavior is emerging from. The first is the beast. And without going into details, the beast is the center of the European system of things, headquarters in Brussels, and their policy is decidedly anti-Israel. So they strongly promote the two-state solution. Palestine and the Palestinians are the oppressed, and they're highly critical of Israel's humanitarian restrictions in Gaza and their treatment of Palestinians in general. They oppose the Israeli expansion of settlements in the West Bank. They brand them as illegal settlements. And lastly, they staunchly support the decision by the International Court of Justice, criminal court, which actually sent arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. So all of that is pushing an anti-Israel platform. And it will continue to do so. What about the papacy? Well, we don't hear much about Pope Leo XIV, but what we do know is that their policy hasn't changed across decades. So that is two-state solution, guaranteeing an independent, sovereign Palestinian state along with secure Israel, as though you could have those side by side. You can't. To them, it's the only viable pathway to justice and peace. And interestingly enough, they don't like Israel owning Jerusalem. They have consistently called for Jerusalem to be an international city open to all faiths. Now, Israel has permitted, of course, people to worship in Jerusalem according to their faith, but it's a Jewish capital. And the Vatican has strenuously resisted that. They don't want Jerusalem to be in Jewish hands. So that will continue to pervade. And whilst this Pope's pretty quiet, nevertheless, that policy is continuing against Israel. How Catholic is Europe? Well, there's a map there which shows you the gradations of Catholicism throughout Europe. And you can see that countries like Poland and Italy are up there in the 80 to 100% Catholic. You've got strong Catholic presence in the rest of those European countries. Portugal, too, strongly Catholic. Britain, marginally so, 5-10%. But that's a dominant religion. And although Islam has taken some hold within Europe, Catholicism has gripped Europe and has extended across to countries like, of course, Ukraine and Poland and Romania, very much strongly in favour of Catholicism. And that frog spirit, that anti-Semitic spirit, will continue to emerge from that centre. And then we have Turkey. Well, Erdogan, he has maintained relentless criticism of Israel's government. Relentless. He's accused the Jewish state of genocide. He's nicknamed Netanyahu the butcher of Gaza and likened him to Adolf Hitler. There's no love lost between these people. And Israel's responded, of course. Israel has blocked Turks coming into Israel, and it includes Erdogan's son. So that's going to go down like a ton of bricks. But Israel's responded because they're aware of this massive wave of anti-Semitism coming from Turkey. So out of the mouth of the dragon is coming all of this. Well, what about Tarshish and the young lions? Britain, America, Australia, and so on. Up until December last year, Europe was recognising their need for America within NATO. It's amazing what Trump can do in 2 months. He's turned the whole thing on its head. They put out a US national strategy. And if ever there was an insulting document to the Europeans, it was this particular strategy paper. And what it said was that European civilization is going to go down the tubes. It's going to be erased because of mass migration, regulatory suffocation, rules and regulations and red tape, and suppression of far-right groups. Now, you can imagine Europeans reading this. Trump said we would need to halt NATO expansion, and of course Putin was cheering for that. And lastly, as I mentioned before, that NATO countries would lose their Article 5 protection if they didn't produce more revenue into the NATO bucket. And he openly criticised European leaders who supported Ukraine. Now you can imagine that hitting Europe in December. So much so that the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, said, look, the end of Pax Americana. The damage this document has done has put a wedge between Europe and America. Americans are now very, very ruthlessly pursuing their own interests. And as far as we're concerned, says Germany, we're going to move away from America. Now, we would expect that. We would expect that. America is out of Europe, out of NATO eventually. And then Trump announces a couple of weeks later on, he wants to annex Greenland. And this particular article said that Trump's Greenland threats put the transatlantic alliance on a death watch. So what Europe's been doing is it's been developing its own allied reaction force. And this really is a military solution which embraces European countries and excludes America. So, for example, they're going to hold the largest, or they just held rather in January, the largest NATO exercise without the US. Now, that's unheard of. I mean, US is underpinning NATO military maneuvers, excluded. And Germany now becomes a hub for defense. So this whole wonderful vision of America propping up NATO, within 3 months, Trump destroyed all that. And Europe is furious with Trump, and that will continue. Trump's got another 3 years to go. What will happen the next 3 years will be absolutely interesting to see. Britain. Well, Britain at the moment is not faring particularly well under Sir Keir Starmer. Stagnant growth, stagnant real wages, crumbling public services, the biggest parliamentary majority swept him into power. And now, at the moment, his fortunes are in fact plummeting. One of the pushes by Starmer is to actually go back into the European Union. Now, we know prophetically that Britain has no part in the European Union. What that has done has elevated Nigel Farage. Remember Nigel Farage? He was that very quick politician who slammed the European members of Parliament as much as he could and campaigned for Britain to leave Europe. Well, he's back on the political stage. And Starmer is now setting up a fight with Farage. Starmer's suffering the worst satisfaction rating of any premier in the last half century, including Jeremy Corbyn, who was deeply unpopular. Starmer is trying to get these negotiations with Europe happening. And we'll find, I think, as time progresses, that direction will change. And for those Jews living in the UK, this was the toughest year, and there's no signs of improving in 2026. Why? Well, UK has formally recognised a Palestinian state, going against centuries of tradition, overturning the Balfour Declaration, and there's a very happy Palestinian displaying the embassy of the state of Palestine, which isn't an entity. And as one particular review suggested, that there is no quick way back for UK-Israel relations at the moment, that they are plummeting. Starmer called Israel's blockade of Gaza indefensibly cruel and intolerable. He abruptly ended all trade talks with Israel. He placed sanctions on Israeli settlers, and he supported the arrest warrants of the ICC, and he refused to really protect Jewish people as they attended their synagogue worship. Things have to change dramatically in the UK. This is not the behaviour of the biblical Tarshish at the moment. And with his popularity plummeting, it may be that there could be a change. Just recently, the last few days, he's in trouble over the Epstein scandal, and people are asking him to resign. So we'll wait and see. In relation to Tarshish, though, and Australia, we, of course, have the AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, and the US alliance. It is an interesting alliance. This was the speech by Albanese, saying that we have stood shoulder to shoulder as a country with America, Australia, and Britain over decades, and that we are seeking prosperity. See, it's a merchant declaration. We need prosperity, and we want to protect freedom and respect human rights, which is the announcement of all countries that follow the Declaration of Human Rights. And this will continue on. There'll be bumps in the road, but eventually this alliance between the merchants of Tarshish and Tarshish itself and the Young Lions will be cemented further as military and defence cooperation continues. So that brings us to our final slide. We live in a world where the Lord said it was distress of nations with perplexity. And we experience distress. Pressures upon us all angles. On our young families paying off their mortgage, the cost of housing, getting a job, educating their children at Heritage College. All of these things add pressures, financial pressures, to our young people. The philosophies of the age, the humanism, the wokeism, the theistic evolutionism, all of these pressures impact It's a world full of anxiety and perplexity. And this idea of the waves roaring back and forth is our world, swinging left, swinging right, pivoting here, pivoting there, no certain direction. And subconsciously, that affects the ecclesias. And we have to make sure that we know where we're going. We have a direction in life. Men's hearts fail them for fear, anxiety, mental issues. These affect the world. They affect parts of the brotherhood as well. We're in this age. And the tension in Europe will only ratchet up as nations position themselves for conflict. When these things begin to happen, said our Lord, then look up, lift up, for your redemption draweth nigh. And that's the day we earnestly desire. Sadly, the anxiety, the fear, the uncertainty, the no way out will continue to increase until our Lord comes, and it will challenge every one of us, young and old. It's time to look up, be positive and enthusiastic. Our Lord will soon be in the earth. Thank you.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching. And remember to come back soon.